Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for having me. So yeah, my name's Tony and I'll be presenting my paper, Exposing Genetic Algorithms, a tool for designers to curate bespoke genetic algorithms for their generative design methodologies. Just a little overview of the presentation today. I'll give a quick background of myself and how the research began, then explain what genetic algorithms are, the generative design workflow that is associated with it, also the tool that I developed, and 3 different study models that tested this tool, and then the conclusion. So this paper was part of my master's in architecture at the Bartlett, where I used the opportunity to kind of advance my computational skills through the thesis research. At the time, I was using many different computational tools to design with, but I just wanted to get a greater understanding of the tools that I was using. Especially as a student of architecture that fell in love with coding later on. And in this case, it was evolutionary computation, or more specifically, genetic algorithms. Evolutionary computation belongs in computer science, where there are a family of algorithms inspired by evolution. The research is plentiful, and genetic algorithms, now one of the most famous evolutionary algorithms, have been introduced since John Holland's seminal research in 1992. Since then, projects such as Carl Sims' Evolved Virtual Creatures have utilized this algorithm to explore the idea of evolution. The fundamentals from Holland's algorithmic framework were computational operators that could select, crossover, mutate, and reproduce chromosomes. Selection would occur depending on the fitness of the individual from a fitness test, which then increases its likelihood for mating. Crossover would enact chromosomal crossover, which is reproduction, as the genetic material of each parent is shuffled. Mutation ensures genetic variation and is a process that is essential for evolution to occur. And then over time from this, the data representation of chromosomes have evolved from just beyond an array of bits. So you can store different data types like strings, floats, nested arrays. And then researchers have also developed and introduced new operators to improve the algorithm's performance. And they're still usually kind of inspired by biological processes. This algorithmic framework has translated into design through a generative workflow. So this is where design constraints and goals are used to generate design solutions. And then the evaluation is then determined by the genetic algorithm to filter and evolve over generations. The algorithm has successfully proven itself to optimize designs. For instance, NASA's evolved antennas, where spacecraft antenna in 2006 was designed with a genetic algorithm that minimized the material usage whilst meeting specifications. The result was a design that looks random, yet it went through a series of evolutions to be what it is. So genetic algorithms are essentially known as a search algorithm that identifies high quality solutions to a problem space full of approximations. And this is applicable to architecture as design is subjective, has a varied design criteria, which means that an architectural design solution is always an approximation, that no design is perfect. However, when I looked for tools that use genetic algorithms, I found that many of them used a predetermined algorithm in which the designer could only control through an interface. Therefore, when I wanted to experiment with genetic algorithms itself, the backend was usually black boxed, and I could only vary the process through the data that goes in. So usually just like a parametric model, and then general controls of the evolution process. So this could be the amount of generations it goes through, or the amount of DNAs and genes. Understandably, this is because of the performance of these algorithms are often developed and advanced by researchers outside, so within computer science itself. And they publish these kind of genetic algorithms, like the next advancing ones, whether they have a new component that is more powerful at sorting, or an operator that increases the computational time of the process. And factors like these mean that designers will have no need to adjust the algorithmic framework of the tool when this variation of the genetic algorithm has already proven to perform very well. However, I found that if the predominant use is to optimize design solutions, which is known as exploitation of the generative process, there is also the other use, which is exploration, where the design intent would be just to discover new regions of the solution space and find unexpected design solutions. And as our parametric models grow more complex or computational grow stronger, these solution spaces will grow. And the capabilities of a parametric model can't just be seen by the human impression. So instead, the generative algorithm can be used to search and organize the extent of the design solutions. This is where I question whether a designer could explore their solution space further if they gain control over the algorithmic framework. And to test this hypothesis, I had to develop my own tool that exposed the genetic algorithm and allowed the designer to interface directly with the framework. To create the tool, I used the software called Houdini FX, which has been used predominantly in industries such as film or games to create pipeline tools. In this case, I made use of Houdini's geometry and attribute system to translate parametric models and their parameters into points and point attributes. Each point would represent an individual of a population, and the attributes associated to each individual would be carried throughout the generative process. So this is the parameter values, the fitness scores, or which generation they are at. Then I documented different variations of the core genetic operators as well as more modern operators, such as replacement sorting. And then there was selection mutation crossover from Holland's original framework. This is an example of one of the techniques that's in the tool. So this is roulette wheel selection. I translated the pseudocode into Vex, which is the Houdini's expression language, but also created a simple diagram to help explain the process. And also in the code itself, there's comments to kind of help guide the user through understanding how this pseudocode has been translated into Houdini's software. And then after each technique was translated, the outcome was kind of a series of all these kind of diagrams and code blocks that could kind of form documentation. Once I developed the tool into a working state, I needed to test it against a generative model. So I managed to test it against 3 different study models. The first 2 were from my design project at the time at the Bartlett, and then the third was from a friend at the Bartlett. The use of the tool was evaluated firstly to see if it could exploit, so which is the predominant use of genetic algorithms. Then to test my hypothesis, I wanted to see if I could gain unexpected results from the solution space. And I had my own metric to measure that with. And then finally to test the tool as a tool itself. So in this case, since the third one is an external designer, he tried to test and see how he could use the genetic algorithm for his own design process. Just to give a quick overview for the design project, it was situated in Tokyo, and the architectural themes were post-flood environments at an urban scale. So for this study model, I took a ward in Japan, and the design was to increase the number of waterways to improve natural drainage. The parametric model built these waterways by allocating points across the site, which then connected itself to the closest waterway, resulting in a new network of blue spaces. Therefore, the genetic properties were simply just coordinates of the point. So in this case, it was UV, or they can be read as XY. And then once it's positioned itself, then the other property was in which order these connections were made to form waterways. And then the design output was tested towards 2 objectives. The first one was to minimize the average distance from any waterway to each building plot on site. And then the second objective was to minimize the total length of all the waterways. And then this is just a little quick animation of that model being simulated. So in each point in the parametric model represents a gene, and each design output is a chromosome. In one generation, there was 1,000 design outputs being generated and evaluated. And then on the image on the left is the analysis tool in Houdini, which measures computational time. And computational time is one of the kind of biggest cons of genetic algorithms. And in all the cases of my study model, the fitness test was always the most time consuming. And this is designed by the user, but also is dependent on the machine that's running the simulation. So after 1,000 designs were being generated over 100 generations, the total running time was over 10 hours. But this process wasn't only done once because I wanted to test the exploitation of the tool. So this tool had 13 different variations. So I gave 2 sorting techniques, 4 selection techniques, 4 crossover, 4 mutations, and 3 replacement techniques. So if I were to test every different combination of the kind of the tool, there would be 576. I didn't want to do this a 10-hour simulation 576 times. So I narrowed it down by just kind of having a default configuration where every option was selected onto the first, and then it would only alternate by 1. So that meant I only tested 13 different combinations, which is far less. The results can be seen in a graph, which is the objective space. So the x-axis would be one objective, and then the y-axis another objective. Each plot is the individual from a different generation, or the same if it's depending on the color. So the first generation being red, and then it moves to purple, which is the 100th generation. It shows that these points are slowly converging towards a curve over time. This is known as the Pareto front. So with multiple objectives to compete against, there is no single perfect solution. Instead, there's a set of solutions that are optimal towards both objectives. So if a solution lies along this frontier, there are no other solutions that are better than this individual on a single objective without it worsening the other objective, if that makes any sense. And then on the graph on the right is maps every single combination in its 100th generation. And you can kind of see the Pareto front of each of this combination as well. So since I was trying to minimize both objectives, the best one would be the one that says SR. I'm not sure you can see, that's probably really tiny, but that was the combination that changed to rank selection. But then you could also argue that there's other aspects that could perform better by saying the length of the Pareto front or the area in which the final generation still covers in the objective space. These metrics are usually seen as a convergence speed, diversity length, or coverage area. So not only can you see the best performing individual by just by minimizing the objective or by maximizing, you can also see it by how well they covered the solution space, how diverse they were in the final frontier, or the convergence speed, which is usually commonly measured through hypervolume. And then the individuals that achieve the best score from objective 1 and 2 don't really show a difference at first glance. And this is arguably because of the design strategy itself, because it's just a bunch of rivers on the site. It just looks like it's scattered everywhere. But then there are 2 discoveries I found through this process. The first one was that, which could be the fault of the parametric model, because as the system discovered that points on top of existing rivers would not increase the total length of the river, because it would just be on top of each other, it would not create new rivers. So it would be actually optimizing itself by just not creating new rivers if the objective was to decrease the length of total rivers, if that makes sense. And then the other discovery, which is probably through the genetic algorithm itself, is that one of the combinations, which is average crossover, plotted all the points into the center of the site, which was probably a fault of the technique, not the model. And then this can be seen on the graph on the right, where every combination had the same starting population, which is the red. And then with average crossover, you can see all these populations evolving away from the starting genes and it just finding its own place in the solution space. For my second study model, it was still kind of within the realms of my design project, but the design strategy differed and would also test the tool further by introducing a third objective. It was also a 3D model, and to trade off with computational time, I took a smaller sample of the site. So the first study model took 10 hours to compute 100 generations. This one took 60 hours to compute 200 generations, which I also want to push further. The parametric model basically searches for high rises on the site, and then the flood-prone buildings, which is below the flood line, would act as aggregates to be hosted onto the high rises. Then the parameters were basically the order in which each aggregate would be attracted, where it's positioned in its height, and the U position, so the orientation it would attach to. Then as the model aggregates all the buildings, the three objectives that were measured were the total surface area of the top surfaces, so like the roofs, the uniqueness of the design solution, and the cantilever length from the host. The one objective I kind of want to focus on is the idea of the uniqueness, because this is just my way of kind of quantifying an arguably qualitative objective. And it could be said like it is the designer fine-tuning to push towards an unexpected outcome or something to benefit the exploration. So this is the kind of aggregation process shown in 3 shots. So it starts, the red is the host buildings, the blue is the flood-prone buildings, that would be the aggregates. It's kind of hovered around the red building, and then it's attached and it turns orange. That process is repeated until all the buildings are attached. And then you can kind of see 3 different typologies from this, and it's just shown by kind of the range or the density of the aggregates. And then there's a little animation of one of the buildings being isolated. With this study model, I didn't really find any unexpected results. A lot of it was very much expected. And testing it took like 60 hours. So I didn't want to keep configuring just to try and find something unexpected. So this is one of the downfalls again of genetic algorithms. And then these are the graphs that were outputted from the results. So since there were 3 objectives, 3 axes, 2 of them were maximizing, 1 was minimizing. So you can kind of see it converging downwards and away. And then the Pareto frontier was just a kind of a mesh surface, just to kind of visualize it better. The final study model was in collaboration with another designer, and I was just kind of help him develop a generative system for his design project. He was looking into robotic weaving and modeled the frame and physical system for the robotic arm to weave rubber. He wanted to kind of just see what the kind of different outputs could be depending on the order of the weaving. So the objectives were more aesthetic based rather than a structural material kind of objective. And in this case, it was to maximize the amount of weaving, crisscrossing per weave, or maximize the length of each weave length. And then the outcome of the results can be shown in the graph on the left. It was a discontinuous solution space. So this means that you can kind of see it's not the solution space is creating these kind of 6 islands, I like to call it. And over 100 generations, the individuals would slowly evolve towards the best solution. So that would be the top right, because they're both maximizing. This study model kind of helped me understand this as a tool more, because the designer was kind of getting confused by why am I looking at graphs. So I kind of implemented this kind of analytical tool, just 2 simple squares next to each design solution, just to showcase the first square, red to green, how well it did in objective 1, and then the second square, how well it did in objective 2. And then, so this is kind of where my tool is at now. The whole framework is exposed, so the whole genetic algorithm. There's a level of complexity. I like to think about this. That's how I like to think about it, in the sense that there's still a top level an interface that is very common with other generative tools like these. But you can easily go through the network, and there's like multiple levels. So you can change the order of the algorithmic framework, or you can add different components and experiment, and you can even change the code itself if you wanted to. Half a minute left. So to conclude, when I first started this research, it was very boring and technical. I just did it because the idea of evolution being programmable was very alluring to me. I'm happy that my interest has narrowed into something where I want to discover if genetic algorithms can kind of explore design solutions instead of exploit, which is very common. And then these kind of experimentations that I would like to kind of do in the future is these ideas of just new genetic operators that try to explore instead of exploiting. Since genetics is like very complex, a lot more complex than the traditional framework that was proposed by Holland 20 years ago. And yeah, I just want to develop this more. It's not in Grasshopper or Dynamo, which is, I know they have their own GA tool as well itself. But I think with Houdini and with the way I created this tool, the whole idea of it being exposed helps kind of people get a better understanding of how the algorithms work, but also how to experiment with them. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Tony. Fantastic.